and welcome to today's webinar, where we are going to talk about CI/CD pipelines with Napptive. Before we start, let me introduce myself. I'm Daniel Higuero at the CTO of Napptive. And what we do is basically try to simplify the way developers interact with Kubernetes system by basically taking out all the complexity from the low-level entities. And today, what we would like to talk about is, well, first of all, what is CI/CD? What is the relationship with cloud native applications? And then we will go a little bit about different tested environments and how you typically test your code. And finally, we will go with a practical demo with a sample application that you can also reproduce to showcase how you can integrate basically GitHub Actions with the Napptive platform. All the links related to the Napptive platform, the actions, and the example application are down below in the description, so you can also check that out. And yeah, let's start. So first of all, we need to think a little bit about what is CI/CD and why it matters. If you think about how we develop software, we need to make sure that the code that we are going to put into production satisfies at least some typical constraints, right? We want it to be stable. We want it to be reliable. We want it to work as expected, which sometimes doesn't happen, as we know. And we especially don't want to introduce any new or previous errors back into the code base. So we need something that helps us with the process of making sure that the code that we are putting into production satisfies at least those requirements, right? So enter now the cloud native world, and what is the relationship basically with CI/CD and cloud native? If we take a look to the definition of cloud native applications, we see that cloud native is not only just the fact that you are developing in the cloud or putting an application into production in the cloud. It's more about how you think about the whole environment, on how your development team works, and how your company works in terms of putting out applications to their customers. So from the point of view of cloud native, what we do is we try to focus on the service on our application, which are the one that our customers are consuming, and is the way that we get money back into the company. And we want to make sure that we are able to deliver fast and frequently. We want to put new functionality in front of our customers as soon as possible. We want for that to obtain a rapid development lifecycle. So we want to make fast iteration. And we also want, of course, to leverage all the cloud functionality that we have, right? So this is what we want if we put in our minds, like thinking about cloud native. So which is the relationship with CI/CD systems? CI/CD systems is just a part of the QA, the quality assurance, that makes sure that you are able to automate some processes. If you take a look to the right diagram, you will see like a typical simplified way by which we develop new code. So there is a phase for design where you think about, okay, which is the problem, which is the feature, how are you going to approach the solution? Then you start developing the solution in the language that you use. After you have finished development, you test it out. That doesn't mean that you are going to start writing tests at that point. This is just a check to say, okay, all the tests that I have written behave as expected. The work that I've done works as expected. And once everything is correct and you are satisfied with the solution, you just release the code, right? You make the artifacts, the Docker images, the YAML files, whatever you may need, and you put that so that it can be basically deployed into production. Once you finish that, you will go into the next iteration and say, okay, which is the next feature that I would like to add to my code. So if we compare these to CI/CD, where what happened is that basically we want to do this fast, and we need a way to define our processes for building software and our process to making sure that the software behaves as expected. And for that, we use CI/CD pipelines, which basically allow us to streamline like this feature turnover, because we are going to automate a lot of the steps that are involved in the building and in the testing area, plus the deployment of the solution to potentially a production environment. So which are the main challenges that we face when we start thinking about implanting CI/CD solution in our companies, right? So the first one is more related with CI/CD as an idea, as an approach, always works, But sometimes what we feel is that there is also a problem because defining a pipeline usually means reflecting into the methodology that you are following, not only in terms of development, but also in terms of the company. Like we can think about CI/CD pipelines where everything is done automatically, but that doesn't work sometimes for some particular areas or some companies because there is also policies in place saying no, somebody must actually check and sign a particular release for that becoming into a production release, right? So we need to think also about which is the impact in terms of the business when you are writing this CI/CD pipeline. The classic CI/CD pipeline looks something similar to this. So it always starts with a commit, a new code that is pushed into a branch that we want to build. Building is about basically compiling the code and checking some syntactic errors and things like that. There is a phase after that for testing. We are going to go through different type of tests that you may run. After you are satisfied with the testing, you enter into the release mode where you are going to build all the artifacts that you may need, for example, Docker images, specification YAML files, things like that, or even compressed packages. And once you have that, you will go into the deployed mode, which is basically, okay, everything works as expected. What should I do? Should I put this into a staging environment, into a production one, into a preview environment? What should I do, right? Once that code goes into production, the next thing is to, okay, it enters now the operating mode in which other people of the team typically will look after it for monitoring purposes to see if everything is behaving as expected 2 days after I launch the new release, things like that, right? So how can we start thinking about this, right? So for that, we need to reflect or remember a little bit about the different type of tests that you may run in a general category. The simplest one are what we call unit tests, which are basically related to testing a particular function or method, depending on the programming language. And the thing in here is like, okay, you may test this method with all the potential combinations of possibilities, but at the end of the day, it only gives you a limited result because the coverage that you are measuring is only for a particular functionality in your whole application, right? Acceptance testing, on the other side, is about considering your application as a whole, and you are going to perform tests that typically reflect use cases for your customers. That you are going to go through the different scenarios and making sure that your application works in the scenarios that you have set up, right? So which are the differences among them, right? Typically, you will represent this in a pyramid because unit tests are typically much more in number than acceptance tests, but that also differs from company to company. Other people approach testing more from the first, let's make sure that the acceptance testing works, and then we can drill down into the unit test when we need. That is also valid for some companies. Unit tests are typically quite fast to execute, which is an advantage. Even if we have so many, they are typically quite fast. They're usually executed in a local environment, like you will use the same place that you use for building your binaries. And the effort to fully implement them, I will say, is quite high because there are so many functions in your code base, and you need to think about the different branches that you would like to test for them. So it's more extensive and more effort that you may think of at the very beginning. Integration testing is about testing application with a third-party component that may be a database, that may be an HTTP server, anything that you would like to interact for the test. Acceptance testing is on the opposite side, and they are quite slow typically because they simulate user interactions with the application. They have a distributed nature because at the end of the day, you are going to deploy your application potentially with a full deployment, the same for production. And you also need a test runner component that will be in charge basically of interacting with the application, simulating that user. The effort to fully implement them is, I will say, low. That doesn't mean it's neglectable. There is also quite a high entry barrier if you haven't written any of those before. but it's something that helps you understand how your application behaves from the point of view of the users. So before we continue further, we need to also make some clarification, because when we speak or talk about CI/CD pipelines, there is kind of a problem, because CD also means CD, meaning you can interpret this as continuous deployment when you basically want to automatically deploy the application when everything passes all the barriers, all the checks into production automatically. And there is continuous delivery when you basically just make everything ready for somebody else to say, hey, you can do it, right? So if we can see what it looks like with more granular detail, you will see that it always starts with a commit as before. You will commit the code. The CI pipeline is about building, checking all the type of tests that you may have. Depending on where you work, you will miss some of them, or you are not using any of them. For example, there are a lot of people that are not using acceptance testing. And if you go with the continuous deployment path, you will see that basically after the tests are correct, you will put the application into a staging environment. You will perform the checks that you may need there, like, for example, running some real traffic through it or something like that. Once everything seems to be working as expected, there will be some promotion checks that will take care of that, like, for example, error rates not going up into the sky, things like that. You will put that application into production. If you go the continuous delivery pipeline way, what will happen is basically there will be points in which an operator needs to review whatever the system is ready to do, right? Like, for example, you may get a notification saying, hey, there is a new commit, a new revision that wants to be tested in staging. There will be somebody saying, yes, I want to test this in this particular staging environment. After everything is, all the promotion checks that you may do in the other part are ready, that will be presented also to an operator, and that will be the person in charge of saying, yes, let's promote this and let's put this into production. So this is like a review of what CI/CD pipelines are in general terms. Which are the main pain points that we usually find, right? First of all, it's about creating testing environments. If you imagine requiring installing a new cluster for every test, that increases the cost, increases the time that you spend waiting for the test to run, and that could be a blocking point where you have a big development team making a lot of changes to the code base at the same time, right? So we want to have a method to create testing environments that is cost effective and has minimal overhead and is fast, basically, right? Then we need to think about how we are going to effectively deploy the different application components. Like, for example, the application under test that you will, if you are running acceptance testing plus the test runner, you may want some additional infrastructure in the form of databases, for example, that could differ from the production installation in the way of, for testing, you may only want like one replica in the database because you want a fast iteration and you are not especially testing areas of reliability for the database. So there should be a method to basically get an advantage on that and make these type of things easier, right? So how are we going to show all of this? Basically, what we've done, I've created a sample application, which is a Node.js application, which represents just implements a basic to-do list, where you are able to add new items, remove items, mark them as done, things like that. We are going to use Express as the framework for the REST API. And we are also going to use Jasmine for unit and integration testing. And we are going to use Postman for acceptance testing. The idea of all of these is to be able to go through all and every step into the pipeline to be as extensive as possible, so you can then make an analogy with the ones that you have in your workplace, right? So the application, what will happen is, like, we are going to launch an API. That API has some sample endpoints, like the root one, health, to-dos, things like that. And there are some of them that are related to managing like the items inside the to-do list. For the sake of simplicity, we are not going to link a database to this. That information will be kept in memory. But you can easily add a database to the mix if you want to, right? To execute all the CI/CD pipeline, we are going to leverage GitHub Actions. And unit and integration test, it will run directly with the GitHub actions that already exist in GitHub. And the acceptance testing will basically leverage our capability to make testing environments quite easily, and will also leverage some GitHub actions that we have specifically written, so that you can basically integrate them into your project much more easily, right? So let's see what the application looks like and the different elements that we are going to interact with. So before we start with the application, let me show you, like, this is the classic UI for the playground, where we are going to see the applications being deployed in a particular environment. This is the repository for the example application that we are going to play around with. I have set up the actions to be manually launched. So let me start launching the application, the pipeline, because it will take some time, and we will kind of go through the application that this is running. Okay. As you can see here, there is no other environment. That's the default one. There is no application in my account. The pipeline have started to run. So let's go while it goes a little bit through the application code. So it's a quite basic Node.js application. You will see here, like in server.js, is where we are going to play around with this hello world for this particular webinar. What you have here is on to-do. You have the implementation as a class for a to-do list, basically with items and methods to work with the different items. This is kept in memory, as I said, but you can connect a database with it after that if you wish. The routes define the API endpoints that are public, basically, and can be used for adding, removing, or getting all of them. There is also a health check one. You want to play around with that also for the future. And the spec is where we actually write our tests. Unit tests are stored in this to-do spec, and this is just basic tests about adding or removing items, things like that you may expect. API ones are real more integration tests, in which you are basically launching an HTTP server and you are querying it through the HTTP protocol. So I will say this is kind of integration test, but that's debatable for some people. So just bear that in mind. I will consider this an integration test. And yeah, that's it. And then we have acceptance testing, right? So acceptance testing is defined on this file. This uses Newman, which is like the CLI version of Postman, if you wish. And here you can write basically like, okay, which are the different elements that you want to test. So what we are doing here basically is creating a new item, adding a new item, getting the ID that is returned, marking it as done, and removing the item. Okay, it's quite a simple one. Let me see how this is behaving. There are many steps into the pipeline. We have done that more for teaching purposes than for practicality. As a curiosity, is also you will get better results in GitHub if you kind of compress all of this into fewer steps. It will cost you less minutes in your pipeline, but I think that for the sake of this sample, it is much better, right? So what we are doing here is basically following the previous path, where we are running unit integration testing. We are building the software at the same time. Then we are pushing the Docker images that will store our applications. We are pushing the application definition, the YAML files, and rendering them. We are preparing an environment for launching the acceptance test. We are going to launch the acceptance test, and depending on the outcome of them, we are going to promote the application or not. Okay, so let me show you a little bit of background, or give you a little bit of background about how acceptance testing works with Napptive. What we have done here is basically we have created a new environment. It has the name that is shown in here, like it will be my account name to do that, plus some ID that is taken for the GitHub run ID, so that you can have completely different and isolated environment for each of your pull requests, right? In that place, in that environment, we will launch the API, and we will launch also the acceptance tester, which will go through the different tests that we have defined in Newman, and basically we'll take a look to the results, and if everything works as expected, then it will promote the application so that it can be deployed. Okay. Let me this. So as you can see here, what happens is after we launch the acceptance test and we get the result, we start both cleaning the environment that we have just created, and we also start going through the creating the production environment if it doesn't exist, checking if the application is deployed, and deploying the application. So if we go back here now and check, we have now a new environment, which is this to-do app production, simulating like this is our target environment we want to deploy applications on. You can go and see that the application has been deployed, it's using this version 001, and you get here like an expose endpoint for the application, so you can play around also for your laptop, and it's returning hello world, as you may expect, right? So what we are going to do to show how all of this works, that we explain other stuff, is let's go to the code base, let's change the version, let's change the content, and let's push this are not using any pull request right now, just for the sake of the simplicity of the sample, but usually you will do that. So let's also start querying like the application that is deployed. So you can see here, like this is every 2 seconds we are querying that endpoint. And what we are going to do is to launch the same pipeline. Remember that this has been set up to be manually launched, but in reality you typically will do that. Sorry. You will do that connected to a pull request or something similar to that, and we can start seeing what is going on the example, right? So as this progresses, let's go back and let's start exploring what is happening here, right, in these different environments. So as we said before, the initial steps are related to building the images that you may need. So if you go into Tix, for example, you will see that this is just a classic Docker login that is integrated with the classic GitHub action, right? We're pushing application definitions into a catalog. This catalog is basically an abstraction that we have in Napptive. And if you click on this icon, you will see a list of applications that are basically ready to launch and ready to use. The idea of this is that you will be able to upload your application definitions, not Docker images. Those are still being uploaded to Docker Hub, for example, in this case. But you will be able to have a place in which you will store all your YAML files in a similar way as you do with the images in Docker Hub, but for application specifications. The idea of this is that then you will be able to say, okay, I want to deploy this application. I will be able to maintain a list of revisions of the application. And this is a central place where you can start collaborating with your team. So you have access, basically an inventory of applications that you work with or your company work with, right? So this is what the catalog is basically doing, is storing application definition, so they can be easily deployed after that. The integration that we have with GitHub, as we will see later on, basically, we push the application first to have it ready to go. But for example, when you, this is where we create the test environment. For example, for this particular run, you see that this was the name, this was the ID of the GitHub runner ID. So you can have basically multiple pull requests be tested at the same time using Napptive. When we launch the applications, what we do is just basically go login into the target environment and deploy directly the application that is stored in the catalog. So there is no need to fiddle around with your files or YAMLs or connections. You can just point to the catalog and say, hey, let's deploy this. This is especially useful when you want, in the context of QA, to store, for example, a definition of the infrastructure for testing, as I mentioned before, like special setups for databases, things like that, that have a reduced footprint just for testing purposes, because you are doing, for example, integration testing or things like that, that doesn't affect the reliability of the database. You can use the catalog for that, right? Cleanup is just saying, hey, let's remove this element. And if you take a look also to the overall amount of time that it takes, preparing a new environment took like 10 seconds, right? So it's quite fast actually to have environment just ready to go without thinking about installing a new infrastructure for your test. Let's see how the previous one is progressing, right? The previous one, the only difference is that after the cleanup, we've checked the application was there. As was already being deployed, we just updated. As you can see here, we changed basically the message changed from hello world to the newer one, right? So this is just a way of seeing like how you can play around with CI/CD system, how you can get all the benefits from having a place to run your tests that you manage, that you can access, and is quite extensible. If we go into here, the application is still running. The only difference right now is that you will see here that now the version has been updated to 0.02, which was the change that we made. And this is basically like everything I want to talk mainly, okay? There is some documentation for if you are curious about these actions that we make for GitHub. This is also a link on the description below. And let's go back to this. So basically, as a conclusion, what we have is a method to enable CI/CD deployments quite efficiently. This runs on top of Kubernetes. You haven't touched any Kubernetes entity to work with this, which is what we aim for, basically. On-demand environments are quite fast to generate, to recycle. You don't need to install a new cluster for a test and then just install it completely. All the environments are already multi-tenant. They have isolated environments so that application in between environments are not mixing around. Kubernetes is a great platform for running QA tests. And I invite you all to go and test the platform. Thanks for attending the webinar. So if there are any question, I think we have some time. So feel free to ask any question. I will do my best to answer them. Okay, let's wait 1 minute more. Somebody has a particular question. As I said, just feel free to create an account. It will just use your GitHub identity as a user, and it's free to use. You have a QR there to sign up for free. You will have an environment with an amount of quota, and you can play around with it, deploying your own applications either from the catalog or just from the from your CLI, basically with kubectl or our Playground CLI tool. Okay, so I think since there doesn't seem to be any questions, we are going to wrap up the webinar here. Feel free to contact through email, through the web, through Slack, however you may want to contact. If you have any further question or want to discuss something in private, just contact us and we will be happy to answer. Okay, thanks, and see you in the next one.